We are back now to talk more about grief. Now, this is something that we are not very good at in our culture. I think we tend to avoid it, we wish it away, we use cliches like "you're in my thoughts and prayers" instead of facing it head on. Now, to be clear, I think people who say those things mean well, but we need to get better at dealing with grief and supporting others who are experiencing grief. My next guest is someone I met, I don't know, 20 years ago. Does that sound about right? When she was the chaplain for the hospice organization here in Raleigh. Becky Sansbury is also an author who wrote a book called After the Shock, which is about grief. At 74, she's experienced grief firsthand many times, but what she has learned through these moments has informed her and helped others. Becky, welcome to the show. It's so good to have you.
Thank you, Amanda. It's really a treat to be here and to be back with you in professional mode as well as friendship mode.
Well, I really appreciate it. One of the things, that you wrote in your bio that I ask everybody to give me for this show really touched me. And I just want to read it for our listeners. Quote, "Grief invades our lives in many different circumstances, wearing different faces and speaking in different voices. Sometimes we recognize it, but not always. Sometimes we think we have addressed it and moved on, but not always. Sometimes we think that if we are, quote, strong enough, it will leave us alone. But that almost never happens." And I just thought that was so touching because that's been my experience as well with grief, that we just think we can wish it away, and that's just not possible.
No, we can't wish it away. And the other thing that we can't do, Amanda, is that we can't logic it away. And I have great appreciation for an increasing number of books and articles that are being written about grief. And I mean, I dare not say too much. My book, as you said, addresses grief. But I think we have to be very careful that we don't assume we can read enough, listen to enough podcasts, consult with enough professionals to suddenly magically take care of it.
Yeah, I remember when my mom was dying, and we'll talk more about that as we get into the show. People give me a lot of books, and I remember thinking, I'm not sure I'm ready to read this book right now because it just wasn't computing with me.
I have a suggestion about that. The suggestion, if the book is being given directly to you, is to do one of two things to acknowledge the gift. And one is to be very honest and say, I really appreciate this. I'm just not, and you can use your own choice of words. I'm not up to reading things right now, or you can even make it a little lighter if the person's uncomfortable. My brain just isn't focusing on things right now. Or if you happen to be in a group of shared friends, my suggestion is to give the book to one or two people in that small group
To read.
because then they will have a better idea of how to be a support to the person who's grieving. And then maybe 6 months later, if the person has shown appreciation or felt comfortable or said, oh, you really helped me, then to say, well, if you're up to it, or you might want to read chapter 2.
Right, they might have some suggestions about what would be helpful. Be careful of hitting the table.
Thank you.
I am a hand talker as well.
Hadn't even thought of that.
Hand talker. And I know also from your background, you had a lovely upbringing in Pennsylvania. I'm from Pennsylvania as well, outside of Philadelphia. But you said that your biggest experience or first major experience with grief was going through some miscarriages. And I don't think we always as women associate that with grief, but that's a grief for the child that you will never know.
That's absolutely correct. And I think because depending on the circumstances, for some women physically, the miscarriage happens, and then whatever medically needs to happen after it, it's a fairly quick process. And then it's like, well, boom, you're done. And you get a variety of answers depending on your physical circumstances. Either, this was a fluke. One of the answers back when I was going through the experience, which was many years ago, and they didn't know why I had miscarried, was if it's applied in a religious term, well, God was probably preventing you from having an ill child or a child with deformities or difficulties. That one is really, really rough. But the other thing is just accepting the not knowing why.
Right.
But the other thing is that it's not only the loss in the moment, but it's the loss that continues through the years of what would have been milestones in that person's life. And so, as you may be seeing other friends whose children are going to school, or having a first date, or going to the prom, or off to college, or any of those types of things, whether you have other children or not, either way, there is a place in you that feels
That void.
that void and that ping within you. And boy, talk about something society really doesn't acknowledge. That's high on the list.
And I want to get more into your background, but you said a few things that made me think of the religious aspect or the spiritual aspect of what people say. And I mentioned in the beginning that, prayers and thoughts that people put on Facebook all the time. And I know you're a spiritual person. Not everybody is.
Correct.
And not everybody wants to hear those words, well, God made this decision. That's really between you and God and not between other people. And so how do you broach that? What's your suggestion for talking to people without putting spirituality or religion first if that's not what works for that person?
Right. If your ultimate goal is to be comforting or supportive to someone, then make sure you have an idea of what in non-crisis times is comforting or supporting to them. People normally don't suddenly become religious, particularly in a time when people may be questioning, even religious people questioning their beliefs that they held before. The other thing is that less is better and not to make assumptions. So language that might be comforting to you might be a little over the edge for somebody else. I always suggest working from the bottom up, what we consider the bottom up, and yet the bottom is the foundation, and that's presence. Show up, because so many people won't, or they'll show up briefly and scatter, or they'll show up one time and then disappear. Your ongoing presence is one of the most comforting things. And then reflecting what that person is presenting. Are they presenting that they perhaps want to hear something that would relate to a faith you already know they have? Or to simply ask gentle questions. How are you feeling right now? Or are you finding something that's helping you right now or not helping you? We don't always think of, without getting too specific or too personal, asking someone going through a tough time, where are you right now? Or what is or is not helping? And if they can't answer, it's fine. You move on from there. It's also good to look for things you can do that are practical and don't rely on words, because any of us, professionally trained or not, don't always have the right words. If you work on developing that relationship, then even if you stumble and you say the wrong thing, it's okay.
Because you're coming from a place of good intentions. Acts of service are my love language.
Good.
And so when my mother was sick and dying, my friends just did incredible things, small things. I had one friend that went to every market looking for this specific tapioca pudding that my mother loved and just arrived at the house with this huge bag without even being asked. And I thought that was so wonderful that she thought to do that. I had another friend that knew I really liked this bread at a bakery, and she would bring it with these great spreads and wine, and we would just, 20 minutes, half an hour, take a little break and enjoy that. I know you went on to have 2 children, but a lot of your health issues, they took a toll, the miscarriages, on your marriage. And then your husband at that time developed mental health issues. And so that was more strain, the end of the marriage. How do you get through these life events and still, keep your head in the game, if you will, to be able to be the person you are, which is somebody that is in service to others?
The first thing you do is realize you don't do it by yourself. You've already alluded to that with friendships. One of the things that helped me a great deal was the presence of what I've now called safe strangers in my life. These are people who have expertise that you trust. They can maintain confidentiality that you trust. And your relationship may be a professional one. It may be something that you need at that moment. And these connections may end up being just for that particular time or situation, but they can help to guide you through. I remember the physician at Johns Hopkins University Hospital who took the time to show me my former husband's brain scans. And when he didn't have the emotional space to be able to say, this, or this is probably your husband's future or how it's going to affect him, he used the tool that he could, his science and his medical knowledge. And he got me a pass to come with him into the part of the lab where I could look at the brain scans and he could explain medically, but in understandable language, what I could then figure out for myself as far as the part of the brain that had been affected. That was a safe stranger. Along the way, there were counselors and therapists, there were chaplains and social workers and people with all that ilk, and I latched on to every one of them that I could. Some of them helped me a lot, some of them just a little bit. But I'd like to tell you about one, and it may answer that part of your question. It was a therapist I had been referred to, and coming out of my background, this was a gentleman who was described as, quote, a Christian therapist. My thought was, I don't care if he's Buddhist, Hindu, whatever, if he can help me get through this crazy time, I'll talk to him. So I went in, and for about 45 minutes, I poured out my tale of woe, probably didn't take a breath. He was a kindly older gentleman, and he looked at me and he said, Becky, he said, I see you have all your clothes on, and they're pointing in the right, he said, I see you have all your clothes on. I was horrified, Amanda. I thought, what kind of a creep have I been talking to? And I said, I certainly do. Then he took a breath and he said, I see they're pointing all in the right direction and none of them are inside out. And I said, I actually looked and I said, you're right. He said, if you can get up every day and accomplish that task, everything beyond it is a bonus. I took that to heart, and part of the task of grieving is to give yourself a lot of grace for the moment. And if you have people who are giving you inappropriate friend guidance or advice, give them some grace too. But that scenario and little story has helped me to help other people.
Kind of like just put your one foot in front of the other.
It is, but he tied it to something that I could look
Tangible.
at and tie to at that moment. And frankly, it was a little moment of levity in its own way. And that's one of the things that's so often missing. We don't know how to bring the lighter moments that are safe and appropriate to ourselves or to other people.
And the end of a marriage is also a grieving process, correct?
Absolutely. One wise therapist had me walk into his office, or when I walked into his office, when I hadn't used the words divorce yet, but it was hanging heavy in the air. And the curtains were drawn and very dim lighting. And I said, is there something wrong? And he said, no, there's going to be a funeral in here today. And I thought, well, gee, I wonder who'd have their funeral in a therapist's office. But I sat down and I said, well, I'm sure it's nobody I know. And he said, oh, it is. He said, the funeral is for the husband that you married. And we need to, you know physically that that person is not coming back. What you don't know is who will be here in his place. But we need to acknowledge that that person is gone. Then you can deal with the future.
Would you mind sharing just a little bit what your husband's condition was?
At 33, he had a massive stroke, and it basically wiped out the right frontal cortex of his brain. It fried it. And that's where we make decisions, that's where our emotions are tied in, all of that common sense logic piece, etc. He made, to have been totally paralyzed down the left side, made an amazing physical recovery, and then was sent home from rehab with very little psychological care. And suddenly I had a person on my hands who was raving. And I had two small children. And so in going through various forms of psychiatric care, I was first got a misdiagnosis and 2 years on the wrong medication, was horrendous, and then was re-diagnosed. And he could not deal at that time emotionally with that second diagnosis, which was that he had bipolar disorder, which he had always just self-controlled, and we had no idea. He found that diagnosis to be humiliating, and therefore just wouldn't follow any of the treatment plan or the medications, and it made life unsafe for the children.
For you and your family.
But there was a phoenix that rose out of the ashes, and 5 years later, he listened to friends, long after we were divorced, and he went back, he swallowed his pride, he got treatment, he built a wonderful career, life, remarried. We managed to maintain a friendship and a joint love for our children, and have a deep appreciation for each other to this day.
And that's an incredible thing, because that doesn't happen in many situations. So you went on with all of this life experience. You went on to become the chaplain at Wake County Hospice. When you went in there, what did you know about supporting families when their loved ones were in palliative care, were dying? What did you know about that?
I was very fortunate. I'd had good clinical training at Duke and at Wake Med here in Raleigh.
As a social worker?
As a chaplain.
As a chaplain.
It was a professional chaplain's training.
Understood.
So it was guided, it was monitored, lots of feedback from my two very excellent supervisors and my peers. When I went to work for hospice, I was 3 weeks away from finishing the residency. I had no job, and I was supporting our two children. I was fortunate, a colleague told me about this position. It was 1989. People weren't talking about hospice then, Amanda. And so my colleague said, Becky, guess what? There's an opening for a chaplain at Hospice of Wake County. Now, at any time, we tend to hear what we need to hear. But I was in crisis mode. I was 3 weeks away from no income. And so I heard chaplain and the county in which I lived.
And a job.
And a job.
Right.
I had no idea what hospice was. So I quickly got a book, read it, thought, I think I could do this. And I tell folks that it was like an arranged marriage. They needed a chaplain fast, I needed a job fast, and we ended up falling in love with each other.
And you were there for how long?
14 years.
Wow. And I bet you learned so much from that experience. That's when I met you.
That's right.
I met you there doing a story. I don't remember the story, but I was there and you were there. What were some of the things that you will never forget about that experience, about how to help people and support people through grief?
One of the things for which I am incredibly grateful are the life lessons from patients and families and the folks that surrounded them, as well as my colleagues, obviously. But it was what I call the life wisdom that was shared. And while I appreciate all the clinical training I got in seminary and hospitals, etc., I go back to one of my best teachers was a lady who was short on public school education and long on life education. And her husband had been our patient, and I'd gotten to know her well through that. And in that experience, we had become close to each other, and I sat often at her farmhouse kitchen table and shared a cup of coffee and heard stories. When he died, or after he died, I went back for a follow-up and a closure visit. And this very stoic farm lady sat there, and she looked at me with her little work-hardened hands on the table, and she said, I just can't get over this. She said, I was never a crying person, and suddenly I just cry, and I'll go out in public, or I'll just cry, or I go to church and I just cry. Well, you have to remember, Amanda, that at this point I was perhaps 6 to 8 months in the job. I was fresh out of all my clinical training. So I took her sweet little hand and I patted her and I said, now, Mrs. Brown, we have to remember that our tears are therapeutic. And I paused and she paused. And she looked at me and she said, well, honey, They may be thera whatever, but they sure are darn inconvenient.
So she put you in your place a
I
little bit.
never told anybody again that their tears were therapeutic.
Yeah, I can see why. I can see why. You talk a little bit about After the Shock, which is your book. What is the focus, and what kind of advice do you give people, especially as adults? Because I think it's really hard as adults because everybody just expects us to buck up and go back to our life, 48 hours later after you losing a parent or something. What do you tell people in your book?
Well, I want to address that point you just made first, and that is there is no exact timeline for grief. There's not, if we put it in a sports metaphor, there's not first, second, third quarter, fourth quarter. There is not a, hey, we hit the goalpost, we scored, we're done, we won. It is something that is as personal as each of us, and rather than thinking of it in sections, we do best when we think of it more like waves in the ocean. And it will come and go and affect us in different ways at different times. My mother has been dead for 2.5 years, and this year when I was decorating the Christmas tree, I found myself with tears streaming down my face because that's what the two of us had done together. And when she was very old and couldn't do that, she still loved to hear the stories of each ornament that went on the tree. There are things that will come and go for us. And one of the points for my book was to, as much as possible, normalize for us as adults this whole messy process, but that is a part of life. And if we think of the important things in life, frankly, they are messy. Giving birth is messy. Making our way into relationships gets messy, or out of relationships. I can remember my grandmother, the Pennsylvania grandmother, teaching me to cook. And I asked her, I said, "Is it hard, Grandma?" And she said, "Not if you don't mind messing around a little bit." And that's where we are with life, and as grief is a part of life. And we tend to want to isolate it. And my goal was to help normalize the way we move through things. One of the things I did was I established, because we are often visual people, a metaphor for what helps us to do that. It was a picture of just a standard car. And if you think of the 4 wheels of the car, I related to those to our 4 parts or components of stability, just like the wheels keep the car going on the road. And whether it's good times or bad times, they are comfort, control, community, and connection to something that's bigger than ourselves. And then we frame that with experience, our own experiences that we can draw and learn from, or other people's whom we trust. And then they're guided or steered by our assumptions and our beliefs. Sometimes they're heading us in the direction we want to go, and sometimes we have to course correct and say, that belief might have worked for me before, but during or following this crisis, I need to adjust what I think about that. And then finally, it's the fuel of resources. What do we have? What do we need? Who can help us to get what we need? Or do we need to change fuel now? If you drove a diesel car before and you switched to a hybrid, you wouldn't pull into the BP station and put the exact same thing in your car. Or if you tried to, it wouldn't go down the road. So sometimes going through a crisis of any type, and particularly where there's any type of a grief that involves an ending or a closure, then the types of resources you may need may bear a little thinking through. This worked for me before, does it work now? So that was the framework of the book and the work that I've done since writing it. And my hope is that it will equip not only those who are going through grief, but as we mentioned earlier, those who accompany. Neighbors, friends from near and far, if you're part of a faith community or another organization, where it's that connection to something bigger than yourself. Then those folks have some tools to work with to give ideas about how to meet any of those components. We began this by talking about the book and giving resources to somebody. Well, that may not be the resource they need right at that time. and it may or may not be the framework that's going to help shelter their little car of life to get down the road. But it might be fine for somebody else or at another time.
Yeah, I think it is very individual. When my mom was dying in 2012, I did a Caring Bridge post, and I ended up writing a book called The Living Room. And I really wanted to make sure people understood I wasn't giving advice, that I'm not a professional. And I was just sharing my journey, and a lot of people related to it on Caring Bridge, and that's why I decided to write about it. But it was, I think the thing that struck me the most was how much grief changes you. And those changes might not be obvious at first, but there was a quote, and I wish I could remember who said it, but the quote is, the two things that change us the most in life are grief and travel. And I think a big part of that is because we are taken out of our comfort zone, and we are put in a place where we have to learn how to cope differently, just as you were describing.
And both of them take us to new places in life, whether it's geographically or emotionally. So I definitely agree with the grief and travel. One of the things, and by the way, I read The Living Room. I love The Living Room.
Thank
and
you.
I read it while my mother was under my care near the end of her life. And so it had a double meaning to me.
Well, thank you.
Absolutely. Grief does change us. And one of the things we start off right off the bat not having much of any idea about is how much it changes us in the moment. And that can be in the moment of whether it's what I call big G grief or little g grief. We'll say the big G grief is death, the death of a person, a relationship, anything. It's the final conclusion. But there are all the little g griefs that we deal with in life too. And let's just say illness, as your mother dealt with an illness. From the moment of diagnosis, particularly if it's a serious diagnosis on, there's lots of little g's.
Because you're grieving the loss of that person already. You know they're going to die. Right. They know they're going to die.
But you're also grieving, oh, this was the day she could no longer do X, Y, or Z. This is the day suddenly we were dealing with new kinds of pain. Or this is the day we were dealing with symptoms I couldn't control. There's lots of little griefs along the way. And the ways that all of this changes us is that it affects at different times every core of our being. People don't realize that grief has a profound physical effect upon us. And so they may go to their doctor with symptoms that they're not understanding, and they're very real symptoms, but have no idea that it's at least in some part being generated or at least exacerbated by their grief. So digestive problems, changes in sleep patterns, changes in eating patterns, headaches, backaches, all of those types of things which may have at least some part within them tied into, anchored in our grief. Obviously, we're aware of sadness, or for some people they're aware that it increases their irritation, their anger, their...
right, so there's mental health and emotional side effects.
But the other part, particularly for people who are still working, is that also it can affect our cognitive abilities. So depending on how dramatic the grief is, it always can affect our ability to concentrate or focus, our ability to absorb material that we're reading, our ability to then take that material and do something with it if you're in a job where you have to take material and then do something. And it also affects our ability to make decisions. And so when you put all those together, then we've suddenly got a whole total human package. And some of those stick around longer than others, and some of them are just momentary, but they are, as my friend said, they're all darn inconvenient.
Absolutely. And I know we could talk about this forever, but the one thing I think that we didn't really get into is just the fact that there are different griefs. There are, we grieve the loss of a grandparent, a parent, a pet, a spouse, and possibly, I would think, for most people, a child is the worst in terms of how most people see that and handle that and cope with that, because it's something, you know, as a parent you can't imagine. So we can't treat them the same.
We can't treat them the same, but I think it does help us to understand that the the core of that actually is the same. What may be different is how it affects, or the meaning that it has to the person who is grieving. We have to be very careful. For example, if you are a parent, and perhaps you have a friend who may still be a parent, but has a beloved pet that dies. And to realize, well, why are you grieving so heavily? Because you've still got your children or your grandchildren or whoever. And what we don't know is the significance that that loss has
to that person.
The other thing to remember is that grief is cumulative. And so sometimes a loss that might seem on the surface to not be so deep may actually unearth something from our past, which we may or may not connect at the moment, but that suddenly makes this such a profound, overwhelming experience.
So there's definitely many, many layers to it. And so if I'm hearing you correctly, it's give yourself grace, give yourself space and time, reach out to people.
Absolutely.
Some people that you know well, some people that you don't know. Tell people what you need. Be honest. Be transparent. This is what I need. This is what you could do to help me right now.
And allow your circle of support to be fluid. Sometimes it will be the same people with you, but people can burn out, even when they're not just running away from you. So be able to realize that your best friend doesn't have to be your only support through this. It also becomes challenging when you've got a family unit where multiple people are grieving, and we don't do it the same way at the same time. We're not comforted the same way, and yet we're all kind of looking out for each other. So it's very important to have people who are not just part of the tight inner circle be allowed to come and go and just provide their part, whatever it is.
Becky, how can people find the book, and how can they follow what you're doing?
The book is on Amazon, which makes it pretty simple, and it's After the Shock by Becky Sansbury. I am semi-retired, so I'm not as much in the public eye as you are now, Amanda, or have been for a long time. But, if somebody really needs to reach me, BeckySansbury@gmail.com works.
Okay, that sounds great. Becky, thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise with us today. I think the audience will learn a whole lot from this conversation.
Thank you, Amanda. It has been an honor and a treat.